Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, stepping outside your home, and instead of seeing paved streets filled with cars, you encounter dusty roads where horses are still tied to wooden posts. Picture a world where the spirit of the Wild West never faded into history books, where saloons still swing their doors open at noon, and where the law is enforced not by modern police departments with radios and computers, but by sheriffs wearing tin stars and carrying 6 shooters on their hips. What if the Old West, that legendary period of American history that shaped so much of our national identity, had somehow persisted through the decades, surviving the march of progress and technological advancement? What would our world look like today if the frontier mentality, the gunslinger culture, and the untamed wilderness of the American West had never truly ended? Before we dive deep into this fascinating alternate reality, I need your help to make this documentary reach as many people as possible. Can we hit 100 comments on this video? That's right, just 100 thoughtful comments from viewers like you who are captivated by these incredible what-if scenarios. But here's the thing, to reach that goal, I need you to do 2 crucial things right now. First, hit that subscribe button. When you subscribe, YouTube's algorithm prioritizes our content for you, meaning you'll never miss another mind-bending documentary like this one. Those who subscribe and watch until the very end are remembered first by the platform, putting you ahead of everyone else. Second, and this is equally important, watch this entire video all the way through. The algorithm rewards complete views, and your dedication helps us continue bringing you these inspiring, thought-provoking documentaries. We need to hit this goal to keep producing content that makes you think, question, and imagine. So subscribe now, commit to watching until the final second, and let's build this community together. Now, let's transport ourselves into this alternate timeline where the Old West never died. Close your eyes for a moment and truly imagine what this means. The year is still 2025, but the world you know has been fundamentally transformed by one simple change in history. The Wild West era that began in the early 1800s and supposedly ended around 1912 never actually concluded. The frontier remained a frontier. The lawless territories stayed lawless. The cowboy culture didn't fade into nostalgia and Hollywood movies, but continued evolving, adapting, and persisting through the 20th century and into our present day. Let's start by understanding what would have needed to happen for this scenario to unfold. The Old West began to disappear primarily because of industrialization, the expansion of the railroad system, the establishment of federal law enforcement, the closing of the frontier, and the modernization of American society. For the Wild West to exist today, these forces of change would have needed to be significantly weakened or redirected. Perhaps the federal government never gained the strength it did, remaining weak and decentralized. Maybe the Industrial Revolution took a different path in America, one that didn't lead to the rapid urbanization and technological advancement we experienced. Or possibly, vast regions of the American West remained so remote, so difficult to tame, that they resisted modernization entirely, becoming permanent pockets of frontier culture. In this alternate present, the geography of America would be drastically different. The coastal cities might have modernized to some degree, developing technologies and infrastructure similar to what we have today. But the heart of the country, that vast expanse between the Mississippi River and the Pacific coast, would remain largely undeveloped. Towns would still be small, separated by hundreds of miles of open range where cattle roam freely and outlaws can disappear into the wilderness. The population distribution would be wildly different too. Instead of 330 million Americans, perhaps only 150 million people would inhabit the United States, with the majority clustered in the east and west coasts. leaving the interior as sparsely populated as it was in 1870. Transportation in this world would be a fascinating hybrid of old and new. While the coasts might have access to automobiles, airplanes, and modern conveniences, the interior regions would still rely primarily on horses, stagecoaches, and perhaps some early automobiles that have been maintained and modified over the decades. The famous Pony Express, which in our timeline lasted only 18 months, might have evolved into a sophisticated network of riders who still deliver mail and urgent messages across the frontier, now equipped with better maps, relay stations, and perhaps even some radio communication for emergencies, though the infrastructure would be limited. Trains would still exist, but the railroad network would be far less extensive, with many territories accessible only by horseback or wagon train. The economy of this alternate America would be fundamentally different. Agriculture and ranching would dominate the national economy, with cattle drives still being a common occurrence, though perhaps organized with slightly more modern logistics. The discovery and exploitation of oil, gold, silver, and other natural resources would still happen, but the boom and bust cycle of frontier mining towns would continue perpetually. Ghost towns would appear and disappear with alarming regularity as prospectors chase the next big strike. Banking would be a precarious business, with most transactions still happening in cash or gold, and bank robberies remaining a constant threat that keeps security measures primitive but heavily armed. Speaking of security, let's talk about law enforcement in this enduring Wild West. The modern American criminal justice system as we know it simply wouldn't exist in much of the country. Instead, law enforcement would remain hyper-local and personality-driven. Sheriffs would still be elected officials in small towns, often serving as judge, jury, and executioner in practical terms. Federal marshals would roam the territories, but their jurisdiction would be limited and their resources stretched impossibly thin. Bounty hunters would be a legitimate and common profession, with wanted posters offering substantial rewards for capturing or killing dangerous outlaws. The concept of due process would be inconsistent at best, with frontier justice often being swift, brutal, and final. Gunfights would not be Hollywood dramatizations, but regular occurrences in this world. Every town would have its Boot Hill Cemetery, constantly receiving new residents who died with their boots on. The practice of open carry wouldn't be a controversial political issue, but an absolute necessity for survival. Children would learn to shoot almost as soon as they could walk, not for sport, but for protection against both human threats and wild animals. The weapon technology would be interesting to consider. Would gun manufacturers have continued improving revolvers and rifles without developing automatic weapons? Would the Old West's preference for reliable, simple firearms have prevented the arms race that led to modern military weaponry? Perhaps the six-shooter and the Winchester rifle would have been refined to incredible levels of craftsmanship, but never fundamentally replaced. The social structure of this persistent frontier would maintain many of the characteristics we associate with the historical Wild West, but evolved over more than a century. Women in frontier territories might have gradually gained more rights and independence out of sheer necessity, as the harsh conditions require everyone to be tough and capable. The saloon girl, the school mom, the ranch owner's daughter, these archetypes would have developed into more complex roles as generations passed. Female sheriffs, ranch owners, and gunfighters might not be common, but they wouldn't be unheard of either, earning respect through demonstrated competence rather than progressive social movements. Native American relations would be one of the most complex and potentially tragic aspects of this alternate history. In our timeline, native tribes were systematically displaced, their lands seized, and their populations devastated by the late 19th century. In a world where the frontier never closed, this conflict would have continued for more than a century. However, it's possible that after generations of warfare, some form of uneasy coexistence might have developed. with certain territories recognized as native lands where tribal law supersedes any other authority. Trading posts and border towns would exist where cultures mix, and perhaps a unique hybrid culture would emerge from sustained contact. Alternatively, the conflict could have intensified, leading to even more devastating consequences for indigenous populations. Technology would advance in strange, selective ways in this scenario. The technologies most useful for frontier life would be adopted and refined, while others might never develop at all. Refrigeration might be widespread to preserve meat on long cattle drives. Telegraph and eventually radio communication would be crucial for coordinating across vast distances. Medical technology would likely be more advanced in treating gunshot wounds, infections, and other trauma common to violent frontier life, but preventive medicine and public health might lag far behind. There might be no internet, no smartphones, no social media, but perhaps remarkably sophisticated systems for tracking outlaws, coordinating posses, and sharing information about threats across the territories. Entertainment and culture would be radically different. The Hollywood film industry might never have developed as we know it, or if it did, it would be documenting and celebrating ongoing frontier life rather than mythologizing a dead past. Music would still be dominated by folk traditions, with saloon piano players, traveling musicians, and campfire songs remaining the primary forms of entertainment rather than recorded music and concerts. Literature would include ongoing accounts of real frontier adventures, with dime novels based on actual contemporary events rather than historical fiction. Sports might include rodeo events, shooting competitions, and horse racing as the primary national pastimes rather than football, basketball, and baseball. Education would be incredibly uneven in this America. Coastal cities might have universities and advanced schools, but in the frontier territories, a one-room schoolhouse with a single teacher educating children of all ages would still be the norm. Literacy rates in frontier regions would be lower, with many children pulled from school to work on family ranches or farms. The curriculum would focus heavily on practical skills necessary for survival rather than classical education. Religious education would play a larger role, as circuit preachers and frontier churches would remain among the few institutions connecting scattered communities. Now, what about governance and politics in this scenario? The United States government would likely be far weaker and more decentralized than in our timeline. States would have much more autonomy, and frontier territories might exist in a permanent state of quasi-governance, neither fully incorporated as states nor completely lawless. The presidency would be a less powerful position, with presidents focusing primarily on coastal defense, foreign relations, and mediating disputes between regions rather than implementing nationwide policies. Congress would be dominated by representatives from more established regions, with frontier territories having little voice in national affairs. Political corruption would be rampant, with railroad barons, cattle kings, and mining magnates essentially buying political influence openly rather than through the sophisticated lobbying and campaign finance systems we have today. Foreign relations would be fascinating to consider in this alternate timeline. A less industrialized, less unified America would be a weaker presence on the world stage. The United States might not have become a global superpower in the 20th century. Both world wars might have unfolded very differently without American industrial might and military intervention, potentially leading to completely different outcomes that would have reshaped the entire world. Mexico might have been able to reclaim some territories lost in the Mexican-American War, seeing an opportunity in American weakness. European powers might have maintained more influence in the Western Hemisphere. Health and medicine in the enduring frontier would be a constant struggle, Diseases that we've largely eliminated through vaccination and public health measures would remain common killers. Smallpox, cholera, typhoid, and other infectious diseases would regularly sweep through frontier communities, decimating populations that lack access to modern medical care. The average life expectancy would be dramatically lower, perhaps barely exceeding 50 years in frontier regions. Childbirth would remain extremely dangerous for both mothers and infants. Doctors would be rare and precious in frontier towns, often serving areas covering hundreds of square miles. Folk remedies, dubious patent medicines, and desperate prayers would be the primary healthcare system for most people. Let's talk about the environment in this scenario. With industrialization limited or localized, pollution would be far less severe in most of the country. The skies would be clearer, the rivers cleaner, and wildlife more abundant. Buffalo herds, which were nearly exterminated in our timeline, might still roam the Great Plains in substantial numbers, though they'd face constant pressure from hunting. The landscape would remain more wild and untamed, with vast forests, prairies, and mountain ranges relatively untouched by human development. However, localized environmental destruction would still occur around mining operations and in areas of intensive cattle ranching, where overgrazing could turn grasslands to dust. The psychology and culture of people living in this perpetual frontier would be shaped by constant proximity to danger and death. The frontier mentality that we romanticize in our history would be the lived reality for millions of people. Self-reliance wouldn't be an ideological preference, but an absolute necessity for survival. Trust would be a precious commodity, carefully given and easily lost. Communities would be tight-knit by necessity, with neighbors depending on each other for protection and mutual aid, but also potentially torn apart by feuds that could last generations. Honor culture would remain strong, with personal reputation and respect being matters of life and death. What about minorities in this alternate America? African Americans, many of whose ancestors came west after the Civil War, in our timeline seeking freedom and opportunity, would face a complex situation. Without federal civil rights enforcement, racial discrimination would remain openly practiced in many areas, but the frontier's desperate need for capable people might create some spaces where individuals could be judged more by their abilities than their skin color. Some of the most famous lawmen and cowboys of the historical Old West were black, and this might continue in our alternate timeline. Hispanic communities in the Southwest would maintain stronger cultural ties to Mexico and might exist in a more fluid, cross-border culture rather than being as thoroughly Americanized. Asian immigrants, particularly Chinese laborers, who were crucial in building the railroads, would face ongoing discrimination and violence, but also establish their own communities and possibly carve out economic niches through sheer perseverance. Communication with the outside world would be limited and precious for frontier dwellers. News from the East Coast might take weeks or months to reach remote territories. World events would feel distant and largely irrelevant to people focused on daily survival. This isolation would foster regional identities far stronger than we have today, with people identifying primarily with their town or territory rather than with the nation as a whole. Newspapers, when they existed, would focus primarily on local events, with national and international news being brief and often outdated by the time it was printed. Crime and violence would be a daily reality in this world. The violent crime rate would be astronomically higher than in our modern society. Murders, robberies, assaults, and feuds would be common occurrences. Organized gangs of outlaws would control certain territories, essentially operating as parallel governments that collect their own taxes through theft and extortion. The lack of forensic science and modern investigative techniques would mean most crimes go unsolved unless witnessed directly, Capital punishment would be frequent and public, with hangings being community events that everyone attends. The concept of rehabilitation wouldn't exist. Criminals would be killed, imprisoned in harsh conditions, or run out of town. Think about how religion would function in this ongoing frontier. Churches would be central to community life, not just for spiritual reasons, but because they'd be among the few institutions providing social services, education, and a sense of moral order in chaotic times. Frontier preachers would be charismatic figures who travel between communities, bringing news, performing marriages and funerals, and attempting to provide moral guidance. Religious revival meetings would be major social events. However, the harsh realities of frontier life might also create a more pragmatic, less doctrinaire approach to faith, with survival sometimes taking precedence over scripture. Fashion and material culture would be dictated entirely by function in frontier areas. The iconic cowboy attire we see in movies wouldn't be costume but practical work clothes, durable denim, leather chaps to protect legs while riding through brush, wide-brimmed hats for sun protection, bandanas to filter dust, boots designed for riding rather than walking. In more established towns, people might dress more formally for special occasions, maintaining Victorian-era fashion sensibilities that evolved at a much slower pace than in our timeline. Personal possessions would be few and cherished, with people owning only what they could carry or defend. Food in this frontier world would be simple, repetitive, and often scarce. The cowboy diet of beef, beans, coffee, and biscuits would remain standard for many people. Hunting and fishing would supplement purchased provisions. Preservation techniques like smoking, salting, and drying would be essential skills. Scurvy and other nutritional deficiency diseases would be common due to lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, especially in winter or in desert regions. Water quality would be a constant concern, with many illnesses spread through contaminated water sources. Alcohol would be widely consumed, partly because it was often safer than water, and partly because it provided one of the few escapes from a hard life. Now, imagine being a child growing up in this alternate America. If you were born in a frontier territory, your childhood would be radically different from modern American childhood. Formal education would be minimal and inconsistent. You'd be working alongside your parents from a very young age, learning practical skills necessary for survival. Many children wouldn't live to adulthood, claimed by disease, accidents, or violence. Those who survived would grow up fast, taking on adult responsibilities in their early teens. Coming of age might be marked by receiving your first gun or being sent on your first cattle drive. Play would often involve practicing survival skills. Childhood innocence, as we understand it, would be a luxury few frontier children could afford. The concept of retirement wouldn't exist for most people in this world. You'd work until you physically couldn't anymore, and then you'd depend on family to care for you if you were lucky. Many people would die while still working, quite literally working themselves to death. The elderly who survived would be respected for their experience and knowledge, but would also be vulnerable in a society with no social safety net. Frontier life would be especially hard on aging bodies, broken down by years of physical labor, inadequate nutrition, and lack of medical care. Let's consider how this alternate America would interact with modern technology developed elsewhere in the world. Even if America remained largely frozen in a Wild West state, other countries would continue advancing. European nations, Asian powers, and others would develop automobiles, aircraft, computers, and eventually digital technology. This would create a bizarre situation where American frontier dwellers might have limited exposure to advanced technology through trade, travelers, or rare imports, but wouldn't have the infrastructure or industrial base to adopt these technologies widely. Imagine a frontier town where the sheriff still wears a six-shooter and rides a horse, but the town's one wealthy merchant has a crackling radio that picks up broadcasts from San Francisco or New York. bringing news of a world that seems like fantasy to the locals. Picture a traveling salesman arriving by train with a wind-up phonograph, demonstrating it in a saloon to the amazement of cowboys who've never heard recorded music before. This technological disparity would create interesting dynamics. Coastal American cities that maintain trade with the rest of the world might be relatively modern, creating a situation where traveling from New York to a frontier territory would be like traveling 100 years backward in time. Young people from frontier regions who ventured to coastal cities or even abroad would experience severe culture shock, encountering technologies and social norms completely foreign to their upbringing. Some might choose to stay in the modern world, while others might return to the frontier, perhaps bringing back small technological innovations that could be adapted to frontier life. The perpetual frontier would also affect American mythology and national identity in profound ways. In our timeline, the Old West became romanticized precisely because it ended, becoming a source of nostalgia and fantasy. In this alternate timeline, there'd be no romanticization because it would be lived reality. The cowboy wouldn't be an icon, but just a job, often a low-paying, dangerous one. The marshal wouldn't be a hero, but a local official, sometimes corrupt, sometimes incompetent, occasionally genuinely trying to maintain order against impossible odds. The gunfighter wouldn't be glamorous, but would be seen as what they really were: killers, whether justified or not. American literature and art would have a very different character, likely much grimmer and more realistic about frontier life, since there'd be no distance from which to romanticize it. International immigration to America would likely be dramatically reduced in this scenario. The promise of America in our timeline was opportunity, prosperity, and modern living standards that exceeded what most of the world offered. An America still stuck in a frontier phase would be far less attractive to immigrants. Why would someone leave Europe or Asia to face hardship, violence, and primitive living conditions in the American West when they could seek opportunities in more developed nations? Immigration might be limited to the most desperate, the most adventurous, or those fleeing situations even worse than the frontier. This would dramatically change the ethnic and cultural composition of America, leaving it far more homogeneous and Anglo-dominated than our diverse modern society. Now think about how love, relationships, and family would function in this enduring Wild West. Marriage would be primarily an economic and survival arrangement rather than a romantic ideal. Men would need wives to cook, maintain households, and bear children. Women would need husbands for protection and economic support. Love might develop, but compatibility and complementary skills would be more important factors in choosing a partner. Divorce would be rare, not because marriages were happy, but because divorce was socially unacceptable and economically impractical. Domestic violence would be common and rarely punished. Women would have few options for leaving abusive situations. However, widows and single women who inherited property or businesses might gain a kind of independence unknown to married women, managing ranches or businesses and earning grudging respect for their competence. Child rearing would be focused entirely on preparing children for frontier life. Sons would be taught to ride, shoot, ranch, or practice their father's trade. Daughters would learn domestic skills essential for managing a household under primitive conditions. Education in reading, writing, and arithmetic would be valued if available, but secondary to practical skills. Corporal punishment would be common and considered necessary for survival, teaching children to obey immediately in situations where hesitation could be fatal. Childhood trauma would be widespread but unrecognized as such, simply accepted as part of growing up in a hard world. Think about entertainment and leisure time in this scenario. For most frontier dwellers, leisure would be rare and precious. When it occurred, entertainment would be simple and communal. Saturday nights in town might bring people together at the saloon for drinking, gambling, and socializing. Traveling shows, when they came through, would be major events that the whole town attended. Storytelling around campfires or in bunkhouses would be a primary form of entertainment, with tales growing taller with each retelling. Reading material would be scarce and treasured, with books and newspapers passed around until they fell apart. Music would be something people made themselves rather than consumed, with guitars, harmonicas, and fiddles providing accompaniment for dances and sing-alongs. The sense of time would be fundamentally different in this perpetual frontier. Without the constant connectivity and rapid pace of modern life, time would move slower. Seasons would be more important than days of the week. The rhythm of life would follow natural cycles, planting and harvest, cattle drives, weather patterns. Patience would be a survival trait, with people understanding that nothing happens quickly when you're traveling by horse or waiting for supplies to arrive by stagecoach. The modern anxiety about wasting time or being productive every moment wouldn't exist because the pace of life wouldn't allow it. As we consider this alternate world in detail, we must ask ourselves, what would we have lost by having the Old West persist? We'd have lost much of the technological progress that defines modern life. Medical advances that save millions of lives would be absent. The communication technologies that connect us globally wouldn't exist in most of America. The entertainment, art, and culture that enrich our lives would be dramatically impoverished. The legal protections and civil rights that we often take for granted would be largely absent. The physical comforts of climate control, indoor plumbing, and consistent food supply would be luxuries for the few rather than expectations for all. But what might we have gained? A deeper connection to the land and the natural world, a level of self-reliance and practical competence that most modern people lack. Stronger local communities bound by genuine interdependence rather than digital connections. A simpler life with clearer purposes and without the constant overstimulation of modern media. A society where personal character and demonstrated ability mattered more than credentials or social media presence. Freedom from many modern anxieties, even as we faced older, more immediate dangers. Would people be happier in this alternate timeline? That's impossible to say. Happiness is relative and contextual. Frontier dwellers might not miss technologies they never knew existed. They might find meaning and satisfaction in surviving and building a life under difficult circumstances. But they'd also face constant hardship, see loved ones die with regularity, and live with violence and uncertainty we can barely imagine. Life expectancy would be lower, but perhaps the years lived would feel more immediate and real. Every moment precious because death was always close. As we near the end of this journey through an alternate America where the Wild West never ended, I want you to reflect on what this thought experiment reveals about our own world. By imagining what we'd lose without modernization, we gain appreciation for what we have. The rule of law, imperfect as it may be, is better than frontier justice. Modern medicine, for all its costs and complications, is better than frontier doctors with their limited knowledge and tools. The ability to communicate instantly across the world, despite its drawbacks, beats waiting weeks for news. Yet this exercise also reminds us of what we've lost: independence, practical skills, close-knit communities, and a direct relationship with the natural world. The Old West that existed in history was a brief, transitional period, lasting only a few generations before civilization caught up with the frontier. It was a time of tremendous hardship, but also incredible opportunity, where individuals could reinvent themselves and determined people could carve out new lives. It was violent, unjust, and often tragic, but it also embodied certain values, courage, self-reliance, honor, that we still admire even if we wouldn't want to live under frontier conditions. If the Old West had persisted until today, America would be a fundamentally different nation, and the world would be a different place. the superpower that shaped the 20th century wouldn't have existed. Technologies we rely on might never have been developed. Millions of people alive today might never have been born, while others who died young in our timeline might have lived. The butterfly effect of this single change would ripple through everything, altering history in ways impossible to fully predict. This thought experiment shows us that history isn't inevitable. The modern world we inhabit resulted from countless decisions, circumstances, and chances that could have gone differently. The closing of the frontier, the industrialization of America, the growth of federal power, none of these were guaranteed. They happened through a combination of geography, economics, technology, politics, and individual choices. A few different decisions, a few changed circumstances, and we might inhabit a very different world today. So what do you think? Could you survive in this alternate America where the Wild West never ended? Would you want to? What aspects of frontier life appeal to you? And what would you find intolerable? How do you think your own life would be different if you'd been born into that world instead of this one? And if you'd like, tell me where in the world you're watching this video from. Your comment is important, and I want to read and respond to it. For more exciting stories like this, click on the video that's playing on your screen right now.